Welcome back to Philosophy of Ethics. I usually include G.E. Moore in my section on utilitarianism, but we're technically off the subject. G.E. Moore is not a utilitarian, but he was heavily influenced by utilitarians such as Sidgwick, and has one of the best articulations of the arguments against John Stuart Mill, also originally from Sidgwick. This is part one because otherwise this video would get way too long. So this presentation is a kind of philosophical wrestling match between Moore and Mill. If you have not watched my video on John Stuart Mill's ethics, it's not required for understanding this, but still recommended. Link in the description. As a reminder, there are three essential qualities of utilitarianism. They are consequentialist, meaning that results matter and nothing else does. They are hedonistic, which means that the only valuable thing is happiness or pleasure, both meaning the same thing. And they are impartial, meaning no one is special, the whole community is morally equal, and the whole community must be included. Mill has a proof for utilitarianism, and that's the first thing under fire. Moore includes lots of quotes, and he starts here. Happiness is desirable, and the only thing desirable as an end. All other things being only desirable as means to that end. Questions about ends are, in other words, questions about what things are desirable. Moore says, I am quoting these repetitions because they make it plain what otherwise might have been doubted, that Mill is using the words desirable or desirable as an end as absolutely and precisely equivalent to the words good as an end. In other words, Moore's starting to explain Mill's mistake by showing that Mill uses the word desirable as an ethical term, meaning good. Mill also says that questions of ultimate ends are not amenable to direct proof. Mill instead thinks that an indirect proof is possible. And Moore doesn't have an issue with this. However, Moore thinks that Mill is, in fact, giving too direct a proof when he shouldn't be. Moore will construct his own view later, but for now, he wants to show why Mill's proof doesn't work. So, here's Mill's proof. The only proof capable of being given that a thing is visible is that people actually see it. The only proof that a sound is audible is that people hear it, and so of the other sources of our experience. In like manner, I apprehend the sole evidence it is possible to produce that anything is desirable is that people do actually desire it. If the end which the utilitarian doctrine proposes to itself were not, in theory and in practice, acknowledged to be an end, nothing could ever convince any person that it was so. No reason can be given why the general happiness is desirable, except that each person, so far as he believes it to be attainable, desires his own happiness. Fallacy. Moore has a lot to say about the proof. First, desirable does not mean able to be desired, as visible means able to be seen. Remember, desirable has already been used to mean good, so it can't mean able now. The desirable means simply what ought to be desired or deserves to be desired, just as the detestable means not what can be, but what ought to be detested. Whether or not pleasure is the only thing desired is, as Mill himself admits, a psychological question. So the word desirable is an ethical term, but the word desired is a psychological term. The font color of the psychological terms are in green, and the ethical terms are in blue for Moore to help demonstrate the distinction. And here's what they look like in Mill's original proof. Clearly, Mill has mixed psychology and ethics together, and that makes his logic highly suspect. Mill has then smuggled in, under cover of the word desirable, the very notion about which he ought to be quite clear. Desirable is an ethical word, but desires is a psychological word. Mill has committed a specific type of fallacy of equivocation, and Moore calls this the naturalistic fallacy. A fallacy of equivocation is when one word is used, but the speaker changes definitions of the word midway through the discussion. It would be like saying that all bats are mammals. Some bats, especially in professional baseball, are made of wood. Therefore, some mammals are made out of wood. The English word bat simply has multiple meanings, and the previous syllogism is invalid because of the equivocation. Moore calls Mill's specific version of this fallacy the naturalistic fallacy. So what is the naturalistic fallacy exactly? Moore doesn't think that ethics is part of the natural world. He thinks ethics is real, but it's non-natural. This means you cannot learn ethics through your five senses. Instead, you know ethics through a sixth sense, intuition. The naturalistic fallacy is when we attempt to derive aught which is non-natural from how the world is. Just because it's true that I like sugar doesn't mean that it's good for me. This is not the first time anyone has said that this is a fallacy either. This was more famously argued by David Hume in the 1700s. Mill's naturalistic fallacy confuses psychology, desire of pleasure, with ethics, pleasure is desirable. The natural world would contain expected things like physics, biology, statistics, feelings, and politics or legality. And what More is proposing is that ethics does not belong in the same category. Ethics would not be alone in this category either. There are plenty of contenders for this category, and you'll notice that many of them would be similarly controversial. For example, trying to argue that souls can't exist because we have bodies absolutely ignores what anybody would mean by the term soul. Likewise, trying to prove the soul's existence through the body would be equally problematic. The two worlds don't mix well, and it's why Mill's proof is especially concerning to More. Also in More's sights is the distinction Mill makes between higher and lower pleasures. Mill says, of two pleasures, if there be one to which all or almost all have experience of both, give a decided preference, irrespective of any feeling of moral obligation to prefer it, that is the more desirable pleasure. Mill means that some pleasures are better than other pleasures because of quality, as opposed to mere quantity. These are called higher pleasures. Notably, Bentham does not agree with Mill's higher pleasures. In the previous video, I used this graph to help show that Mill will always pick higher pleasures first before even considering lower pleasures. From the above choices, Mill would think option B is the most ethical because it maxes out higher pleasures, then, secondarily, it picks the option with the most lower pleasure. Option D is the least moral because it has the least higher pleasure associated with it, despite the fact that it has the most lower pleasure. More responds saying, pleasant must, if words are to have any meaning at all, denote some one quality common to all things that are pleasant. Can one pleasure be pleasanter than another, except in the sense that it gives more pleasure? What does preferred mean? It cannot mean more desired, since, as we know, the degree of desire is always, according to Mill, in exact proportion to the degree of pleasantness. So, Mill can't mean that higher pleasures are better without also undermining his own psychological understanding of desire that he put forward earlier. Further from More, if one pleasure can differ from another in quality, that means that pleasure is something complex, something composed, in fact, of pleasure in addition to that which produces pleasure. It is plain that if you say color alone is good as an end, then you can give no possible reason for preferring one color to another. Is red more of a color than blue? If no type of color can be more of a color than another, how can one type of pleasure be more of a pleasure? If you add any other quality or split that quality in two, you either depart from consequentialism by saying that both the source and the result matter, or you depart from hedonism by saying that pleasure matters more when in conjunction with the human intellect. For a visual aid, let's go back to the graph of higher and lower pleasures one more time. This is an XY coordinate graph, right? And it's graphing X values and Y values. That's two values. Pleasure cannot be two values in a utilitarian system. They only value one thing, pleasurable results for the whole community. This ends part 1 of More. This video was strictly More's critiques of Mill, and part 2 is More's own development exiting utilitarianism. Thank you for watching.